Sorry, Dorina. Tanya, yeah, okay. Namabin, Rob Zena, Henry Wiersma, Paul Wick, Omar Farouk, and myself, Derek Summers. And of course, we have Fazal Khan, and we have Amy Stein on as well. All right. Do I need to include regrets today, Fazal, or is that something we don't?
You could
worry
read that out, the ones that we've received.
Regrets we've received today were from our chair, Stephen Kinsella, and Elsa Lee. So we'll go right ahead with everything. I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional land of the Algonquin peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, live, and learn on this land, and by doing so, pay respect to its first inhabitants. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Welcome, everyone. And note that registrants joining us to use this session as self-directed CE hours. All right. So we'll jump in with what's on the agenda today. And I know Fazal says to jump to you, but I'm going to skip you. Do we have any conflicts of interest to declare? No, seeing none. All right. And can I get a adoption of the agenda today?
Kevin.
Samir, I see the motion, and Kevin, I see a seconder. All in favor? And that's passed. Okay. All right. So let's move on. And Fazal, can I hand it over to you?
Yeah, you know what? We've got, have we adopted the agenda? Sorry, I was flipping paper.
I did adopt the agenda, Fazal. Sorry, I jumped ahead of you. I missed the bridge.
So Derek, if you can call for a motion to approve the agenda.
I did.
Okay.
It's been fun.
Perfect.
And it was
Okay, so we're basically going to jump into the meat and potatoes of today's meeting. So we are going to be talking about the emergency class of registration. Essentially, we're looking at the proposed amendments. We've had some new input from the government, and Amy is going to take us through the briefing notes and sort of set out our marching orders here.
Thanks, Fazal. So good morning, everyone. So we are giving an update just to speak to what was in the briefing note for you this week. When we embarked on this journey with the emergency class of registration back in January, we did so on some advice from the ministry to build these amendments on top of amendments that are already pending to our registration regulation. There was the hope that this could all be approved as a single package. However, a few weeks ago, the ministry contacted us to let us know that that is not going to be possible at this time. And instead, they've received instructions to proceed only with amendments related to the creation of the emergency class. They asked us to therefore go back and resubmit the amendments based on our existing registration regulation rather than the amended version, which is the form that we had previously submitted it in. And this was, it was necessary to get this done on a very expedited timeline, which is why we have you here today on this short notice meeting. So we do greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your day for this. So just a little bit of the sequence of events. In light of the expedited timeline, we have already submitted this to the ministry in draft form. They are aware that the board has not yet approved this, but we wanted to make sure that their legal team and everyone would have an opportunity to work with it so that it can get to the finish line by the deadline established by the government for approval of this regulation. So a little bit about what is different. So as you might recall, when we built this original proposal, the emergency class, again, is there to account for circumstances in the future where there might be disruptions to registration paths or a shortage of health professionals to meet the needs of Ontario patients during some type of emergency, such as a public health emergency like a pandemic. And the work that the registration committee and this board did over the course of the spring was to articulate who would be eligible for this emergency class. And what was decided was that the candidates for this class would be those opticians who had been previously registered and fully practicing, but out of practice for some time. As some of you are aware, typically under our current system, if you have been out of practice for 3 years or less, there's a relatively easy path back to registration. But if it's been more than 3 years, you have to go and your file goes to the registration committee for review. You're typically required to undergo some form of competency gap analysis and potentially some bridging and refresher materials to make sure that you are current and ready to resume practice. The decision of the board in the spring was that this emergency class should be open to people who had practiced within the last 6 years. So instead of the last 3 years, it was expanding that. In other words, the ability to redeploy people in that category more quickly without having to meet more regulatory hurdles. Now, when this was originally submitted, the people in that situation would have been in a brand new inactive class that doesn't currently exist under our regulation. So what we have done here and what's been submitted to the ministry, it aligns with the exact same philosophy that the board approved in April, except that instead of basing it on the language of members of the inactive class, it's registrants who have been suspended within the last 6 years. So this is the category of people who will be eligible for the class. It's technically the same people, they're just being called and referred to in the regulatory language differently. So that is the mechanics of the class. The requirements for this registration class that we had to create also stated that we needed to do a couple of more things. Number one, the regulation needs to specify how the class gets opened. And the other piece is there needs to be a transition path for people in the emergency class to then transition to full registration. And they need to be exempt from at least something that they would have otherwise been required to do in order to make that transition. So the language in this proposed regulation accounts for that as well. There's a couple of nuanced differences from what you looked at in April that I just want to draw your attention to. The first one is with respect to how the class gets opened. So in the original language that was submitted in April, it specified that the class would get opened when the board felt that the emergency circumstances warranted. And that could include circumstances where there's a public health emergency or where the minister makes a request, etc. The ministry came back to us and requested for the sake of consistency with all of the regulatory colleges, that the regulation more specifically refer to the minister's ability to request that the college open the class. So that language has been slightly amended to reflect that, but in essence, it doesn't represent a major shift from the original language because the original language already accounted for the board taking into account, pardon me, my lights have just gone off, a request from the ministry. So it would be hard to imagine a situation where the minister would make a request and the board would not grant such a request. So I think in all practical terms, it's not a significant change. The other slight change is in the transition to the full class. So if you'll recall, we're now talking about people who are referred to differently under the regulation. Prior, in the previous languages, the inactive class, and now we have a suspended optician. So one of the things we needed to be wary of is that the existing regulation, the one that is now being amended, it includes a lot more things than the previous version would have. Once the amendments, the full amendments to the regulation eventually do go through, there's a lot of information in that regulation that we're hoping to actually pull out of the regulation and account for in bylaws and policies. But right now, because it's in the regulation, we needed to draft the language including that. So in terms of the transition from the emergency class to the registered optician class, it now specifies that one of the things that registrants will be exempt from is that typically when someone is applying to have their certificate, their suspension lifted, they would need to establish that they're in compliance with the quality assurance program. For someone in the emergency class, that would be very administratively difficult to figure out what their requirements are. So we have put in a clause, and if we scroll down, I think it's right at the bottom of your screen right now, which is subsection 7 sub 1. It will state that when they transition to the class, they're not going to need to submit proof of that quality assurance compliance. Once they're, of course, a registered optician again, they will be subject to their quality assurance obligations. But this will make it administratively less burdensome to exempt them at that stage for transition purposes. So apart from that, the essentially everything else is the same in practical terms, just worded differently. And if this is approved in this form, just be aware that it will need to be amended again when in the package along with the rest of the amendments. So you will be seeing this hopefully sooner than later down the road, so that it will then be amended to align with the language of our new regulation once the government is able to turn its mind back to that. So that was a lot of technical information, and I will pause there and turn it back over to our chair.
All right, Derek, you're muted.
All right, so I guess we're going to open the floor to questions will be the next step.
Yeah, and if everybody could use their virtual hand, and I will monitor and run the speakers list.
Perfect. And do we have any questions? Are we comfortable with the changes that we're looking at and the reasons why we're making them?
So we've got Samir on deck.
Samir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Maybe just a quick clarification on a couple of things I'm looking for. As we mentioned about section 7 sub 1 about lifting or requirement for the optician, whoever optician is not in practice, and bringing them back under this emergency class. What sort of a measure are we imposing in order to make sure that public is safe? That's one question. And second question I have is around just seeking a clarification around the register who are suspended by the college. Is there any stipulation or is there any restriction on them to consider for the emergency class?
Sorry, Samir, I think your sound cut out for just a second in the second part of that question there. Would you mind just repeating it?
Yeah, sure, no problem at all. So just seeking a clarification around the registrant who are suspended by the college for professional misconduct. Like, what's the stipulation around that? Like, can they apply for this emergency class, or how are they qualifying or not qualifying? Is there any guidance around that area?
Perfect. Thanks, Samir. I'm going to answer that part of the question first, if that's okay. So the class is only available to individuals who are suspended administratively. So it wouldn't apply to people who are suspended for conduct reasons. So they would not be eligible for the class. And then in terms of the public protection, the first part of your question. So the idea behind the emergency class is, we're sort of expanding eligibility beyond what would some of the checks and balances that would typically be in place. So there certainly is a bit of that element to it, but it's recognizing that this would only be where emergency circumstances warranted it. So the checks and balances, though, are that we're still talking about individuals who can establish that they have practiced within the last 6 years, as opposed to individuals who might never have registered in the first place as opticians. There are some colleges where they're opening up the class to individuals in broader categories who may or may not need to practice under supervision while they hold an emergency certificate. So in this case, the board decided in April that this was a balance that would be appropriate in an emergency to look at that 3 to 6 year window and place people back in the field. Now, in order to transition to full licensure, they would need to establish still that they practiced as an emergency optician in a manner that would meet the standards of practice. So they will, there will be some policy work to develop to support this and articulate a little bit more what that will look like. But essentially, it's not just a free pass. There's still going to be checks and balances at every step of the way. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
So I've
All
got Henry and Peggy next.
Yeah, I saw Henry. Henry, your hand went down. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, well, the thing is, Amir asked similar question, and I guess my concern is that the 6 years is a long time. And is the public going to be at risk at all? But I think, Peggy, you've answered that too, so I'm comfortable with it.
Thank you, Henry. Peggy, are we going to you next?
So if I understand this correctly, there needs to be something that they don't have to do when they go from emergency class back to full optician. They would have to do if they hadn't been in the emergency class. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, exactly. That is in the regulation that the ministry passed for setting out the requirements for this emergency class.
And
Yeah.
what is that going to be in this case?
In this case, there's two things. There's one that they won't need to submit proof of compliance with the quality assurance program in order to get that certificate back. Number two, ordinarily, if you're in that 3 to 6 year window, you would need to go through a competency gap analysis in front of the registration committee. They won't be required to do that. Instead, there's going to be a policy around what the bar will be to say that you have practiced as an emergency optician in a manner that would meet the standards. And that bar will necessarily have to be lower than what you would have ordinarily required for someone in that 3 to 6 year category, but it will hopefully, the idea is that it will balance that, that the philosophy behind the emergency class with that public protection to make sure the board is satisfied that this has been accounted for.
And it's that quality assurance that they don't need to do to go from suspended to emergency. Is that correct?
From suspended to emergency, they won't need to demonstrate recent quality assurance because they've been suspended. So when you're suspended, you don't have any quality assurance requirements. So they'll be able to return to practice if they have evidence that they've practiced within the last 6 years. Then they can transition to the full class. Again, they don't need to submit proof of having participated in the quality assurance program as an emergency optician. But once they have their full licensure back, they are subject to all of the quality assurance requirements.
It's that same thing they're skipping in the two pieces.
Exactly.
The two
more or
steps
less.
in the ladder.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think Alicia had her hand up.
Yes,
Alicia-
can you hear
Alicia,
me?
welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So this may tie on to what Peggy just asked, but once the period of emergency has lifted, their status goes back to suspended then, if they do nothing?
They'll have a window, so they can apply while their emergency certificate remains valid or for 6 months after it expires.
Okay,
And then they'll be able to access that transition period. Now, if they don't access it, they go back to suspended and then they can still reinstate
reinstate.
in the
Okay,
manner that the regulation.
yeah, as per normal. Okay,
Exactly.
perfect. Thank you.
And Samir, did I see your hand up?
No, actually, Alicia covered that question. So thank you, Alicia.
All right. Giselle, do we have any more questions that,
I didn't see any hands go up.
so let me put it out to the group. Any other questions, any other things we want to discuss on this before I take it to a motion to approve?
I do want to, Derek, just prompt you to just check in on two different things. If we can maybe just check in with the board that from a public interest standpoint, have we, do we have any issues to identify, or does the board feel satisfied that we've met the public interest?
No, it's good.
Can I also just put one thing in the vein of public interest? Just one thing I want to make sure the board is aware of. It was mentioned in the briefing note, this new draft has not been circulated for stakeholder feedback. So that is typically a requirement under the RHPA before approving a regulation. So because of the expedited nature of these changes, we had some discussions with the ministry and it essentially what we feel, and it's up to the board to decide this, is that it was not necessary to recirculate this because philosophically it's the same as the regulation that was circulated in the spring. It's just mechanically different based on the feedback that we got from the ministry. So this is technically, there are technical changes, but no substantive changes to what the regulation will actually say. So if we could perhaps ask the board to just confirm that you are comfortable with approaching it in this manner and that you believe that this is meeting the public interest requirements.
So let me put it out to the group with that in mind, that is not philosophically different. Are we comfortable with the fact that we're not doing stakeholder feedback on this because of the philosophical similarities? Henry, our 5, yes, let's give it, thank you for the reminder, Henry. Can I get a high five from everybody? All right, and Omar, I do see you. I see that you have a question there, so I am going to come to you.
Yeah, thank you. While in practice as an emergency optician on site, would the public be aware of this? The public on site who would be aware that there is such emergency practice?
I think, Amy, I believe we would be issuing specific badges, like.
Yes,
It's a
their
special
badge,
class.
yeah, their badge will say emergency optician. That's built into the regulation that's how they are required to identify themselves to the public.
Okay, well, thank you.
So with the public interest considerations dealt with, can we open it up and see if there are any DEI considerations we want to look at? Are we comfortable with it from a DEI perspective? Rob, are you giving me a high five or do you have a question?
That's a 5.
All right, let's go. Everybody up. And that looks good. Okay. Alicia, I see you have a question.
I don't know why my hand is raised.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. All right. So Fazal, is that where we need to go with this? Or am I ready to call for a motion? Or do you have something you want to add?
Just want to check in with Samir if that's a question hand that's up.
Yes, it is a question hand up. I'm actually just seeking a clarification regarding Omar's question, just a little bit extending more. Would public have a visibility of emergency class opticing practicing in the field?
So Samir, just to clarify, like, would the public have an understanding of what emergency class means?
No. Question is, say if I'm a patient going into the clinic, would that person, as a patient, how would I know the person that I'm getting service from as an emergency class optician? Or would I be able to search online, say I wanted to see such and such, but hey, he's registered as an emergency class optician. Do I need to? So that sort of thing, like, would there be a visibility for public?
Yeah, so we were like, there is a requirement in our regulation that everyone's got to wear their photo identification. So whether it's a regular optician, intern optician, student, or now emergency optician, so there you'd be, hopefully displaying your badge. The other thing is also the public register would be modified to indicate that new class and the sort of your standing, so the public can search that person up. We'd probably supplement it with some information on the website also to define what this title entails. All
right, so let's check for whether everybody's on board with this. Let's do a high five and all right, seeing that everybody seems to be comfortable, can I get a motion to accept?
Yeah, Omar.
And Omar seconding it, and all in favor? Wonderful.
So can I double check who moved it to start with?
Henry moved it,
Okay.
Omar seconded it.
And all in
we're
favor?
Yeah. And
No abstentions?
no abstentions. No.
Okay, so it carries unanimously.
Yeah, and I think that covers the business for today. So we're gonna make a motion to adjourn. Rob, you'll make that motion to adjourn?
When do we go over the logistics after? Yes, I'll make the motion.
After, yeah.
Okay, seconder for the motion to adjourn. I see Tanya. All in favor?